The badge said Ethan Cole Contract Consultant. It was a pale blue laminate, the kind that got reprinted without ceremony when someone's status changed but their face stayed the same. Ethan wore it clipped to the breast pocket of a gray button-down that had been ironed but not recently. He carried a laptop bag that was old enough to have a fraying strap he'd mended with electrical tape, and under his arm, a brown paper bag that smelled faintly of peanut butter. The drawing sticking out of the top of the bag was on construction paper, crayon, the kind of earnest rendering only a 6-year-old could produce with total conviction. A stick figure in a hard hat, kneeling beside a box of tangled lines. Beneath it, in large uneven letters, "My dad fixes broken things." Ethan tucked it slightly deeper into the bag as he stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor. Hargrove Systems occupied the top 3 floors of a building that looked important from the street and ordinary from the inside open floor plan. Standing desks no one stood at, a kitchen with a coffee machine that had a touch screen and made a sound like a small engine starting. The walls were glass where glass wasn't necessary, which was the aesthetic the previous leadership had chosen to signal transparency and had mostly achieved the effect of making everyone feel observed. The company was in the middle of what its new CEO called a realignment. The board used the word restructuring. The junior staff used the word purge in the break room, and then looked at the glass walls and lowered their voices. Ethan had been a contract consultant at Hargrove for 11 months. Arriving quietly after a series of transitions that no one in the current organization remembered or had bothered to trace. His work orders came through a project manager named Dennis Okafor, who was 29, wore noise-canceling headphones at all times, and communicated almost exclusively through task tickets. Dennis did not know Ethan's last name without checking the system. He referred to him internally as the back-end guy. The back-end, in this case, was a distributed architecture that handled data routing, failover logic, and state synchronization for roughly 40 enterprise clients across 3 continents. It had been built over 4 years. It ran cleanly. It had not failed in any material way in 612 days. No one talked about that number. Ethan sat at his workstation, a desk near the server room, slightly apart from the main floor, and opened his laptop. The first thing he saw was a calendar notification. All hands alignment meeting. Boardroom A, 9 a.m., mandatory. He read the word mandatory twice. He poured coffee from a thermos. The office machine was too loud in the mornings and opened a terminal window. He had 3 outstanding tickets. He began working through the first one. At 8:47, he packed up the thermos, clipped his badge, picked up the brown paper bag, and walked to Boardroom A. The room was already crowded. Most of the technical staff had taken seats along the walls. A cluster of people near the front were people Ethan had never seen before, not in the building, not on any internal org chart. They wore well-fitted clothes and had the posture of people who had recently been told they were important, which was a specific posture, distinct from people who had always known it. Ethan found a spot near the far wall and stood. There were no chairs left, and he didn't look for one. Victoria Hale entered at exactly 9. She was 41, recently promoted from the board itself after the previous CEO's departure, under circumstances that had been described in the press release as a mutual recognition of evolving priorities. She wore dark trousers and a pale blazer. And she carried nothing, no notebook, no device, which meant she had either memorized everything or trusted someone else to document it. Both said something about her. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the room. She did not say good morning. "We have a performance gap," she said. "The current technical infrastructure has not scaled with the company's direction. We're losing enterprise clients, not because of pricing, but because of reliability perception. That changes today." She paused. "I've brought in a team." The people near the front, 5 of them, turned slightly to acknowledge the introduction without quite standing. Their names were given: Marcus Webb, Priya Donovan, Colin Samuels, Jess Hartwell, Derek Fong, senior engineers, systems architects, a credentials list that took 3 minutes to summarize. Ethan listened from the wall. He looked at Marcus Webb once. Marcus Webb did not look back. Victoria Hale did not say Ethan's name for the first 15 minutes. She talked about velocity, about enterprise trust, about the difference between infrastructure that functions and infrastructure that scales with confidence. She used the phrase institutional agility twice. The room listened with the attention of people who were not sure whether they were being addressed or evaluated. Then she said it. "Ethan Cole." He straightened slightly. "Your contract concludes at the end of this quarter. Effective immediately, the transition of back-end responsibilities will begin with the new team." She looked down at something, a single note card, it turned out, held flat against the table with 2 fingers. "We appreciate the continuity work." Continuity work. The phrase sat in the room. Some people glanced toward the wall where Ethan was standing. Most didn't. The 5 new experts had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle near the front of the room. Marcus Webb had his arms folded. Priya Donovan was writing something in a leather notebook. Colin Samuels was looking at the window. None of them looked at Ethan, which was, itself, a kind of answer. Ethan held the paper bag in both hands. "I understand," he said. His voice was level, not flat level. "There is a difference. Flat is the sound of someone who has stopped caring. Level is the sound of someone who is measuring something." Victoria Hale made a small nod and moved on. Someone near the table said something about onboarding timelines. Someone else asked about documentation access. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, during which Ethan stood near the wall and said nothing more. At 9:58, when the room began to empty, he picked up his laptop bag and walked toward the door. Marcus Webb was standing to one side, speaking quietly with Colin Samuels. As Ethan passed, Marcus stopped mid-sentence. Ethan did not pause, but he said, quietly, without breaking stride, without looking at either of them, "If anything breaks, call me." He said it the way someone states a weather fact. Not an offer, not a warning. Just information. Delivered as calmly as a man reading a temperature from a gauge. Marcus said nothing. Behind him, Ethan heard Priya Donovan say, very softly, to no one in particular, "He's not wrong." And then he was out the door, and the elevator was opening, and the morning continued as mornings do, indifferent to the weight of what had just been decided. In the paper bag, the construction paper drawing shifted as he walked. "My dad fixes broken things." Ethan rode the elevator down alone. He stopped at the lobby coffee cart, the small one near the entrance, run by a woman named Rosie, who had been there longer than most of the engineers on the 14th floor, and ordered a medium black. "Rough morning?" Rosie asked. "Not yet," he said. He wasn't being glib. He meant it literally. He took the coffee and walked out into the gray mid-morning air. He had his daughter's lunchbox to drop at her school by noon, and a dentist appointment at 2 that he'd been rescheduling since February. He took out his phone and confirmed both. The system behind him, the one he had spent 4 years building, the one he had left in the hands of the people he had once spent 2 years teaching, continued to run. For now, 6 years ago, Ethan Cole had an office with a door. It was a small office, on a floor that no longer existed under its original designation. Hargrove had gone through 2 rebrands and a restructuring before Victoria Hale's arrival, but it had a window that faced west, and in the late afternoons, when the sun dropped to a certain angle, it lit the room in a way that made everything look slightly more permanent than it was. He was 31 then. His wife, Caroline, had been diagnosed 14 months earlier. He had restructured his own schedule around her treatment cycles in a way that no one in leadership had formally acknowledged, but that his direct team had quietly accommodated. He was the kind of person other engineers came to, not because he was the most senior, he wasn't, at the time, but because when he explained something, it stayed explained. That was the particular gift. Not brilliance, not speed. Clarity. The ability to take a system that had grown complicated in the way that all living systems grow complicated through layered decisions made under pressure, through workarounds that became load-bearing walls, and describe it in terms that made you understand not just how it worked, but why it was built that way, and what that meant for how it could break. He had built the routing framework from the ground up in the winter of the year Caroline was in her second round of treatment. He worked nights, mostly, because she slept more deeply in the early evenings, and was more alert in the mornings. And he had calibrated his schedule around her alertness. The code he wrote during those months was precise, in a way that code written under different circumstances often isn't. He'd had no patience for shortcuts. Every decision was documented, not in the performative way that documentation sometimes is, but in the way a person writes things down when they need to be certain they will still make sense later, when the context is gone. He had run 2 cohorts of internal training in the year that followed. 6 engineers each. The purpose was succession, not his own. But the systems. He wanted the architecture to survive contact with people who hadn't built it. Marcus Webb had been in the first cohort, Priya Donovan in the second. Colin Samuels had been a junior in the first cohort who had asked the most questions, which Ethan had taken as a good sign and which, in retrospect, had been both a good sign and a complicated one. Questions, it turned out, were not the same as understanding. Sometimes questions were a way of appearing to engage, while not quite arriving. Caroline died in the March of the following year. Ethan took 3 weeks off and came back. He lasted another 8 months in the director role before he submitted a request to shift to contract status. The reasons he gave were practical. He needed schedule flexibility, school pickups, medical appointments that had proliferated in the aftermath in ways no one anticipates. The reasons he didn't give were quieter. He had built the thing he set out to build. He had documented it. He had trained the people. He was 33 years old, and his daughter's name was Lily, and she was 3.5, and she called his laptop the Big Black Book because she had seen him staring at it her entire conscious life. He wanted to be there when she looked up, so he became a contractor. He stayed on because the system needed maintenance, and because no one else quite understood the edge cases. He made less money. He had less standing. He wore a pale blue laminate badge and sat near the server room and ate peanut butter sandwiches. His daughter packed for him because she had decided at age 5 that this was her responsibility, and Ethan had not had the heart to disagree. He was, in every formal sense, replaceable. He was, in every technical sense, irreplaceable. No one at Hargrove, in the year before Victoria Hale's arrival, had ever quite reconciled those two facts. Marcus Webb called a team stand-up at 8 a.m. on the second day. He had stayed late the first day, as had Priya and Colin, going through what documentation existed. There was more of it than they expected. It was well organized in a way that technical documentation rarely is, not just what the system did, but why specific decisions had been made, what had been tried before, what failure modes had been accounted for, and how. It was, in Priya's words, said quietly in the server room, to no one in particular, almost like he knew we were going to need this. The stand-up was short. Everyone reported status. No major issues. By midday, the first anomaly appeared. It was small, a latency spike on one of the data routing nodes, lasting approximately 4 seconds before self-correcting. The kind of thing that, in a different system, would have been noise. Marcus flagged it, ran diagnostics, found nothing actionable, and moved on. By the following morning, the spike had recurred 3 times. Routing logic, Colin said, looking at the trace data. Could be. But the load's nominal. Priya pulled up the architecture map. It's not stress-related. Hardware? No flags. They ran the standard diagnostic suite. Everything returned green. By day 3, the latency spikes were clustering around a specific time window late afternoon, between 4 and 5 p.m., coinciding with a particular client's batch processing cycle. The spikes were brief but patterned. Patterned was the word that began to make Marcus Webb slightly uncomfortable. Random failures are one kind of problem. Patterned failures are another kind entirely. Random suggests noise. Patterned suggests cause. There's something in the state synchronization, Priya said. She had been staring at the same section of the routing framework for 2 hours. It's handling concurrent writes in a way I don't follow. What do you mean you don't follow? Colin asked. I mean the logic here, she pointed, at a segment of code doesn't match any pattern I've seen in standard distributed systems design. It's doing something custom, and I don't know why it's custom, which means I don't know what happens if I touch it. Ethan wrote it, Marcus said. A pause. I know, said Priya. They looked at the code for another moment. Derek Fong, who had been quiet for most of the day, said from across the room, "We could call him." Marcus didn't answer right away. "Let's exhaust our own analysis first," he said finally. Nobody disagreed out loud. But that evening, before Marcus left the office, he picked up his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had not opened in 4 years. He read the name. He put the phone back in his pocket. He rode the elevator down in silence. The enterprise client was called Aldrin Financial. They were not the largest client on Hargrove's roster, but they were among the most operationally sensitive. Their batch processing cycles ran twice daily, and their tolerance for latency irregularities had been negotiated down to a specific contractual threshold that the current system had never breached. On the 5th day after the new team took over, it breached. Not catastrophically. Not in a way that produced headlines or immediate client termination, but Aldrin's compliance monitoring system flagged the deviation, generated an automated alert to their own technical team. And within the hour, Hargrove received a formal inquiry. Victoria Hale read the inquiry at 6:47 a.m. and forwarded it to Marcus Webb with a single word: status. The status, by 8:00 a.m. when the team convened, was this. They had identified the latency pattern. They had traced it to the state synchronization layer. They could see the mechanism producing the anomaly. They could not determine, with confidence, whether a direct intervention would resolve it or worsen it, because the surrounding logic was interconnected in ways that weren't fully mapped in the standard documentation, only in the extended notes that Ethan had left, which used terminology and references that appeared, in a few key places, to point to decision rationale that predated the current documentation system. In plain language, they could see the problem. They were not certain what would happen if they tried to fix it. "We patched the state sync logic," Marcus said. "Targeted. Minimal footprint." Priya did not look convinced. "If the patch introduces a conflict with the failover system, it won't." "You don't know that, Marcus. We don't have time to know everything. We have a client inquiry and a 2-hour window before Aldrin's second batch cycle." The patch was applied at 9:23 a.m. By 9:41, the latency spike had disappeared. By 10:15, the failover system, which handled backup routing for 3 additional enterprise clients, began behaving unexpectedly, not catastrophically, not immediately. But it began introducing a consistent 5-second delay into its backup activation sequence, which, for a failover system, is the equivalent of a safety net with a small hole in it. The hole doesn't matter until someone falls. By early afternoon, 2 more clients had filed technical inquiries. By end of day, a 3rd client had escalated to account management. Marcus Webb sat in the server room at 7 p.m. and stared at a screen. Jess Hartwell sat across from him. She had said very little all day, which was not her typical manner. She was usually the person in the room with the most words. She had spent most of the afternoon reading the extended documentation Ethan had left, the sections with the terminology and the decision rationale, and she had been reading it the way someone reads a letter written in a language they almost speak. "We modified something we didn't fully understand," she said. Marcus didn't answer. "I'm not criticizing. I'm stating a fact we need to accept before we can move forward. We have 4 client escalations and a board call tomorrow morning." "I know." Jess closed her laptop. "We need to call Ethan." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "He warned us," Jess said. "Not unkindly, just as a fact. He said if anything breaks." And it broke. By the next morning, it was worse. Overnight, the failover delay had propagated through 2 downstream processes. The data synchronization for Hargrove's largest client, a logistics platform that ran continuous operations, had begun to show integrity flags. Not failures, not yet, but the kind of precursors that precede failures the way humidity precedes rain. Victoria Hale called an emergency meeting at 7 a.m. She stood at the head of the table in boardroom A and looked at her team. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. Marcus Webb told her. He was thorough. He was honest. He did not minimize. He had been in enough failure situations to know that minimizing at the briefing table costs more later than facing the full picture costs now. When he finished, the room was quiet. Victoria looked at him. "Can you fix it?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "Not in the time window we have." Not without he stopped. Without what? Without a deeper understanding of the original architecture than we currently have. Victoria looked at the table. "He built it," she said. Not a question. "Yes." He said to call. "Yes." Another silence. "Call him," she said. Victoria Hale did not wait for the call to be made. She sat in her office at 7:45 a.m. with the company's internal system log archive open on her screen. It was not something she typically accessed directly. She worked at a level where others summarized technical data for her, but she had learned, over her years in operations and then, on the board, that the only way to understand the true state of a company's infrastructure was to look at the original record when no one had yet decided what story to tell about it. She started with the most recent logs and worked backward. The anomaly pattern was clear once she knew what she was looking for. The system had been running in a stable state up to the day of the transition. The first deviation appeared within 18 hours of the new team taking operational control. The subsequent deviations clustered around specific interventions, places where the new team had touched the system. She kept going backward. 612 days without a material failure. She found that number, buried in a summary report from 8 months ago, that no one had flagged because there had been nothing to flag. It was in a routine availability report, the kind that got auto-generated and auto-filed and never read unless something went wrong. 612 days. She went back further, found the initial build logs, found the training documentation, found 2 internal memos from 6 years ago, when Ethan Cole had been a director, proposing the architecture changes that became the system the company currently ran on. The memos were detailed, precise, and anticipatory. In a way that was unusual, they described not just the design, but the most likely failure modes, and the reasoning behind every decision that constrained them. She found the training cohort records. She found the names. She sat for a moment, then she picked up her phone and called Dennis Okafor. "I need Ethan Cole's contact information," she said. "Personal cell, if we have it." "I'll look it up," Dennis said. There was a pause. "Can I ask what?" "Thank you, Dennis." She ended the call. She looked back at the screen. The log was still open. She scrolled to the architecture diagram, the original one, drawn by hand and scanned into the system 6 years ago, the kind of artifact that a different organization would have lost in a server migration. Someone had flagged it as a critical reference document. She looked at the flagging timestamp. Ethan had flagged it himself. 3 years ago, when he transitioned to contract status, he had known, when he left, that they would need it. He had made sure it would be there. Victoria sat back. She was not a person who experienced guilt frequently or expressively. She operated through decisions, and decisions required dispassion. And she was good at it, good enough that people who worked with her sometimes mistook the dispassion for coldness, which was not quite the same thing. But she sat with the log open and was quiet for a moment. She thought about the meeting in boardroom A. The pale blue badge. The paper bag. The way he had said "if anything breaks," and then walked out without a backward look, carrying whatever it was he carried. She thought about the way Marcus Webb and the others had not quite looked at him. She thought about what it would feel like to have built something, really built it, in the particular way that you build a thing you expect to outlast the context it was built in, and then to be told, in a room full of people who learned from you, that your work was the past and theirs was the future. She thought about it for exactly as long as she was willing to think about it. Then she picked up the phone again. Ethan lived in a neighborhood of small houses with big trees. The kind of neighborhood that had been modest for so long it had become a different kind of stable. Not fashionable, not aspirational, just present in the way that things are present when they have outlasted the categories applied to them. The house was a 2-bedroom with a front porch that had a swing nobody used in winter and everyone used in spring, and a side yard with a garden that was currently featuring ambitious plans, tomatoes, beans, a small pumpkin attempt, in states of varying optimism. Victoria Hale's car, a dark gray sedan, clearly not hers. Clearly a company vehicle, pulled up in front at 4:15 on a Thursday. She had called that morning. Ethan had answered after 2 rings. The conversation had been brief. "The system is failing," she said. I know, he said, which was true. He had been watching the public-facing status indicators, the kind that clients see, and had been watching the pattern with a specific kind of attention, not anxious, not satisfied, just watching the way you watch something you have a relationship with. I'd like to come see you. A pause. All right. She knocked at 416. The door was opened by a 6-year-old in a green sweater, who looked up at her with the direct and completely uncalculating gaze of a child who has not yet learned to manage first impressions. Hi, the child said. Hello, Victoria said. Are you from my dad's work? Yes. The child considered this. He says his work is broken, she said. Are you the one who broke it? Victoria paused. Lily, Ethan said, appearing from the hallway. Go finish your drawing. Lily went, with the particular unhurried compliance of a child who is humoring an adult. Ethan held the door open. Victoria stepped inside. The house was warm and slightly cluttered in a way that was clearly lived in rather than neglected books on various surfaces. A pair of small rubber boots by the door. A child's painting taped to the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. The furniture was older, but well-maintained. It smelled like something baking. Banana bread, Ethan said, seeing her register it. She had a phase. It's still ongoing. He gestured toward the living room. Victoria sat on the couch. He sat across from her in a chair that had clearly been sat in many times. She didn't begin with pleasantries. He didn't seem to expect any. The failover delay has propagated, she said. We have 4 escalated client inquiries and a potential material breach with Aldrin Financial. I know. The team traced it to the patch Marcus applied to the state sync layer. Yes. He didn't understand the interdependency with the failover activation sequence. He understood part of it, Ethan said. The part that's documented in the standard reference. He didn't know about the compensating logic in the secondary state handler. I documented that too. But it's in the extended notes, section 7. And it's cross-referenced in a way that requires reading them in sequence. Victoria looked at him. You knew they wouldn't read them in sequence. He said nothing for a moment. I gave them every tool I had, he said. How they used it wasn't mine to control. There was no bitterness in this. It was stated the way a carpenter might state that they built the frame but couldn't control whether the new owners rewired it safely. From the kitchen came the sound of Lily humming to herself, and the scratch of crayons on paper. Victoria looked toward the sound for a moment. I made a decision based on a resume review and a performance gap report, she said. I didn't investigate the source of the current system's stability. No, that was an error in my process. Yes, he wasn't being harsh. He was being precise. The same quality that made his documentation trustworthy. The refusal to soften facts into impressions applied to conversations, too. Lily appeared in the doorway. She was holding a piece of construction paper. I made you this, she said to Victoria, because you look like you need it. Victoria took it. It was a crayon drawing. 2 stick figures standing next to a box with lines coming out of it. One stick figure was smaller than the other. Both were smiling. At the bottom, in Lily's uneven hand. It's okay when things get fixed. Victoria looked at the drawing for a moment longer than she intended to. Thank you, she said. Her voice was slightly different than it had been. Lily nodded with the serene authority of a child who has delivered exactly what was needed and returned to the kitchen. Ethan watched Victoria. She was looking at the drawing. What will it take to stabilize the system? She asked, without looking up. 3 days, he said, if I work through it systematically. Possibly 2, if Marcus and Priya work with me. They understand the architecture better than they think they do. They just need the context they were missing. Will you do it? He didn't answer immediately. Not because the company needs it, he said finally. The clients on the other end of that system are depending on it to run correctly. People's operations. Logistics platforms. Financial data. I didn't build it to fail. I understand. I need to be home by 5:30. Every day. Non-negotiable. Understood. And I need access to the full server environment. No filtered view. Done. Ethan looked at her. Why did you come yourself? He asked. You could have sent Dennis. She considered the question. Because I made the decision, she said. I should deliver the request. He nodded once. Monday, he said. 8 a.m. He arrived at 7:52. He didn't make a point of being early. He arrived at 7:52 because he'd dropped Lily at school at 7:35, and the drive was 17 minutes, and he'd found parking faster than expected. The server room was empty when he walked in. He set his bag down at the station he'd occupied for 11 months. Someone had moved a monitor, which he moved back and opened his laptop. At 8:03, Marcus Webb walked in. They looked at each other. Ethan said, Section 7 of the extended notes. You need to read it before we touch anything, Marcus said. I read it last night. Ethan looked at him. All of it? All of it. A pause. The cross-references too? Marcus exhaled. Most of them. Ethan pulled up a document. Sit down. Let me walk through the compensating logic in the secondary state handler. It'll take 40 minutes. After that, we can start. Priya Donovan appeared in the doorway at 8:06. Ethan glanced at her. Close the door. This'll be faster if it's the three of us. She closed the door. He began. He didn't use slides. He used a whiteboard on the back wall that had been used for other things and still had faint traces of other diagrams beneath whatever had been imperfectly erased. He drew the system in sections, working from the routing layer down to the state synchronization and through to the failover logic, narrating as he drew. He didn't talk about what had gone wrong. He talked about what the system was designed to do and why each component was designed to do it the way it was. Marcus and Priya said very little. At one point, about 20 minutes in, Priya said, The compensating logic is a load-balancing precaution. Yes, Ethan said, and kept drawing. At another point, Marcus said, The patch I applied bypassed it entirely. Ethan kept drawing. He didn't confirm or dismiss this. It was accurate, and he didn't need to say so. At 8:51, he put the marker down. Question, Priya said. Why didn't you document this in the main reference? He looked at her. It is documented. Section 7. Section 7 requires. She stopped. It requires that you read sections 1 through 6 first, in order. Because each section builds on the previous. I wrote that at the top. Page 1, second paragraph. He picked up his coffee. The main reference was written for people who needed to operate the system. Section 7 was written for people who needed to change it. I kept them separate deliberately. A silence. Nobody told us there were two different documents, Marcus said. There's one document, Ethan said. It has 11 sections. He turned back to the screen. We'll start with the failover delay. I'll trace the propagation path. You two handle the state sync rollback, while I work on the compensating logic reinstatement. They worked. It was not dramatic, the work. It was careful and systematic, and occasionally halted while someone checked a log trace or confirmed a value. Ethan moved through it with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly where all the walls are in a room they've walked through in the dark. Colin Samuels came by at 11 and stood in the doorway watching for a moment. Ethan noticed. Colin, he said, without turning. Yeah. Pull up the downstream sync process on client 7. Tell me what the integrity flags show. Colin sat down and did it. They worked until 4. At 4:45, Ethan packed up his laptop. Failover is stable, he said. State sync will take tomorrow. Aldrin cycle runs at 6 p.m. We'll have it clean before then. He picked up his bag. At the door, Marcus said, We forgot how you think. It wasn't an apology, exactly. It was what it was. A statement of fact. Offered plainly. Ethan looked at him. You never forgot, he said. You just stopped making room for it. He left. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday at 9 a.m. Victoria had called it herself, which was significant. Board meetings called by the CEO rather than by the board carried a different gravity. They signaled that the CEO was getting ahead of the story rather than responding to it, which was either an act of confidence or an act of contrition, and the room would be waiting to learn which. Ethan had been asked to attend. He arrived with his laptop and his paper bag. Lily had packed his lunch again. had included a small note that said, "Don't forget to eat," in what appeared to be deliberate large letters, which he folded and put in his shirt pocket. The board members were 7 people of varying ages and considerable collective experience, seated around the oval table in boardroom A, which had not changed in its arrangement since the last meeting there, except that this time, the chairs along the wall were occupied differently. The new team sat together. Marcus, Priya, Colin, Jess, Derek. Not quite as polished as they had appeared 3 weeks ago, but present and attentive in a way they hadn't quite been before. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, which was not where a contractor typically sat at a board meeting. Victoria stood. She spoke for 12 minutes. She described the system failure, the propagation of the fault, the client escalations, and the remediation. She did not use passive voice for any of it. There were no failures that had occurred. There were only failures that she and her team had created through specific decisions. And she named them. She named her own decision first. I authorized the replacement of a contract consultant, whose role I had not adequately investigated prior to the transition. I based that decision on a performance framing that turned out to be inaccurate. The absence of visible contribution is not the same as the absence of contribution. She paused. The system's stability over the past 2 years was not incidental. It was the direct result of maintenance and oversight by Ethan Cole, who built the architecture and has maintained it with a depth of understanding that was not preserved in the transition I authorized. One of the board members, a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had been with the company long enough to have seen its previous versions, looked down the table at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him, without expression. Victoria continued. The fault pattern that emerged was not a failure of the new team's technical competence. It was a failure of contextual knowledge, specifically the interdependency between the state synchronization layer and the failover activation logic, documented in the system's extended reference material, but not communicated in the transition briefing. She clicked to a diagram on the screen behind her. Mr. Cole will walk through the technical failure and the remediation. Ethan stood. He did not have slides. He had the whiteboard diagram he'd photographed that morning and a log trace printout. He stood at the screen and talked through the failure the same way he'd talked through the architecture in the server room methodically, without drama, tracing the cause and effect, with the patience of someone who has explained complex things many times and understands that patience is the mechanism, not a courtesy. He spent 12 minutes on the technical walkthrough. Then he said something that was not in the technical walkthrough. The failure wasn't in the patch, he said. The patch was the trigger. The failure was in the assumption that a system can be operated without understanding how it was designed to fail. He looked at the board. Every system has a failure mode. The question is whether the people operating it know what that failure mode is and why it exists. The documentation I left was intended to convey that. But documentation only works if the people who receive it believe it was written for them. He looked at Victoria. She held his gaze. The transition briefing didn't include me, he said. So the team received documentation without context. And context is not transferable through text alone. I know that. I should have. He stopped. I should have advocated more clearly for a transition period. The room was quiet. He sat down. Gerald Ashworth said, "What would you need to ensure this doesn't recur?" Ethan said, "A structured knowledge transfer protocol. Not a document handoff, a working period, where the outgoing party works alongside the incoming team for at least 60 days. For any system of this complexity, that applies to this transition specifically, or it applies as a general practice," Ethan said. "Every system of this type has a person who understands why it was built the way it was. When that person leaves, you don't just need the documentation, you need the reasoning. Reasoning is harder to transfer, but it's the thing that matters when something breaks in a way the documentation didn't anticipate." Ashworth nodded. Victoria looked at the room. "We removed the only person who understood everything," she said. She said it without inflection, as a fact. Not as performance of contrition. That was an error in judgment, and it had material consequences. The path forward involves correcting that error and building a practice that prevents it from recurring. She looked at Ethan. "There's an offer to discuss when this meeting concludes." Ethan nodded once. The meeting concluded. The offer was substantial. Victoria presented it in her office afterward, just the two of them. No assistants. The room quiet except for the faint sound of the building's climate system. CTO, reporting directly to her. Equity stake commensurate with the value the board had now, belatedly, calculated his contribution to represent. A support structure, a team, an office, with a door. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "No." She looked at him. "Not the title," he clarified. "Not the equity structure as presented, and not the CTO role as defined. I don't want to run a team. I want to be the person who makes sure the system works. That's functionally what a CTO does. A CTO manages people and strategy and board relationships. That's not what I'm good at. What I'm good at is understanding systems deeply enough to keep them from failing in the ways they're going to fail if nobody's paying attention." He leaned forward slightly. "I want a principal engineer role, not management. The salary we can negotiate to fair. I have a number in mind. I want schedule flexibility built into the contract. Not as a courtesy but as a structural requirement, because I have a 6-year-old and she is the priority. And that's a permanent fact." Victoria looked at him. "And," he said, "I want to run a knowledge transfer program. Structured. 60-day minimum. For any significant system transition. Documentation standards that go beyond what we currently require. I'll design it. You want to formalize what you already did informally. I want to make sure the next person doesn't have to rebuild what I built in order to understand it." Victoria considered this. "The equity stake still stands," she said, "not as CTO compensation, as a recognition of the value that was unacknowledged." He was quiet for a moment. "A portion of it," he said. "The rest goes to funding the mentorship program. I want it to be an actual program, not a line item in the training budget." She almost smiled. "Negotiated," she said. He nodded. There was a pause. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yes." "When I said it won't in the boardroom, when you said to call if anything broke, did you know it would?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I knew the probability was high," he said. "The system has specific vulnerabilities that aren't apparent unless you've traced the failure modes I documented. I wrote those failure modes down because I was afraid exactly this would happen. You could have said something more forceful." "I did," he said. "I said it in the documentation. I said it as clearly as I knew how." He looked at her. "Sometimes the most important things get said and not heard. That's not always the speaker's failure." Victoria received this without defense. "No," she said. "Sometimes it isn't." He picked up his bag. "I'll have my terms to Dennis by Monday." "To me," she said. "Directly." He paused. "To you," he said. He left. On the last Friday of the month, the office was quieter than usual. A configuration change had been implemented. The glass partition near the server room had been replaced with a solid wall at Ethan's suggestion, on the grounds that server infrastructure is not a display feature. The open floor plan remained, but several desks had been relocated to reduce visual noise in the technical core. Ethan's workstation had not moved. At 4:30, Lily was dropped off by her after-school program coordinator, a new arrangement, authorized under the flexible contract terms, on Fridays only. She came in with a backpack the size of half her body and immediately set herself up at the unused desk beside her father's station. She had her crayons and a stack of construction paper. The people around her went about their work. Marcus Webb, passing through on his way to the printer, stopped for a moment. Lily was drawing something with total concentration. He watched her for a second, then looked at Ethan, who was focused on his screen. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Sure. Did you ever consider just telling us? Telling us that we didn't understand what we were inheriting?" Ethan looked at him. "Every time I put a comment in the code," he said. "Every footnote in Section 7, every cross-reference." He paused. "I was telling you. You weren't listening yet." Marcus nodded slowly. "We're listening now," he said. "I know," Ethan said. He turned back to his screen. "Lily, without looking up from her drawing, said, "My dad says that's okay. That some things take a while." Marcus looked at her. She was drawing a building with lots of little windows, and inside each window, a small person. "It's the office," she said, still not looking up. "I'm putting everyone in." Marcus looked at the drawing. "Where am I?" he asked. She pointed to a figure in the upper left window. It was a stick figure with neat rectangular shoulders and a round head. "You looked like that," she said, with great confidence. "When you were worried." Marcus considered this. "I was worried," he said. "I know," she said. Everybody could tell. She added a small scribble of color to her figure. "But you're okay now," she said. "I made you smile." She had, in fact, drawn a curved line on the figure's face. Marcus looked at it. "Thank you," he said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to the building. The system ran without a material failure for 37 days after Ethan's return. Then 60. Then 90. The knowledge transfer program launched in the third month. Ethan designed it with Priya Donovan and a technical writer named Sandra Holt, who had been working at the company for 4 years in a role that had been chronically undervalued, and who turned out to have a gift for translating engineering, reasoning into language that other engineers could actually absorb. The program's first cohort ran for 8 weeks. At the end of it, each participant was required to diagram not just the system they'd been trained on, but the failure modes of that system specifically, the ways it could break in the absence of the specific choices that had been made in building it. It was the kind of requirement that could only have been designed by someone who had watched, in real time, what happens when the failure modes are known by one person and inherited by another without transfer. The program ran every quarter. Victoria attended the first cohort's concluding session. She sat in the back and watched Ethan walk a group of 7 engineers through a live failure simulation, a controlled degradation of a test environment, deliberately induced, he walked through in real time, so that the engineers could see not just the failure, but the reasoning required to diagnose and address it. He didn't narrate the failure from above. He worked through it alongside them, asking questions rather than providing answers, making space for the room to find its way toward the diagnosis. At one point, a young engineer named Thomas, 2 months out of graduate school, quiet, extremely fast, with a keyboard said, "The failure mode here is that the failover logic assumes input handling will be clean, but it doesn't validate." Ethan looked at him. "That's the first time someone said that in a training session," he said. Thomas looked uncertain. "Is that bad?" "No," Ethan said. "It's the right answer. It took me 4 months to see it the first time." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. "It's in section 7, he said. "It is," Ethan said. "Third footnote on page 41. Thomas made a note. From the back of the room, Victoria watched. She had a note card in her hand. She'd been taking notes, which was uncharacteristic of her in technical settings, but she had found, in the past 3 months, that taking notes in settings where she was not the expert was a useful discipline, a way of staying honest about what she knew and what she was still learning. On the note card, she had written a single line, not for the board, not for the record, just a thing she had understood, that she wanted to keep. The system worked again, not because it was fixed, but because the right person was finally seen. Outside, in the hallway, Lily was sitting on the floor with her crayons. She had commandeered a patch of wall, the solid one, outside the server room, the one that had replaced the glass, and taped a piece of construction paper to it at child height. She was drawing the office again. This time, the building had a garden. She was drawing the tomatoes.